Hello everybody and welcome along to this video in the series Mr. Johnson teaches Ozymandias. We're talking GCSE English Literature, and within that we're talking about paper 2 here, and within paper 2 this is section B. The exam board will print a question and print one of the 15 poems from the anthology from Power and Conflict, and it's up to you to then decide which poem you are going to choose to compare it with. So it could be that they print Ozymandias with the question, or it could be that they print a question with another poem and you decide that Ozymandias would go really well with it. Either way, it's definitely one of the big ones, I would say, the big ones that you need to know. It's really good at comparing to lots of different poems, Ozymandias, so a good one to be revising. You will definitely need to be ready to pause this video, that's why the pause symbol is there, and absolutely make sure you are making notes as we go through this video. It's going to be really important that you write things down, otherwise you're not actively revising. You'll be half asleep, and then when it comes to the end you won't remember as much that you do if you write things down. So with that all out of the way, let's move on. And my next point I would like to make, in fact, as well, is making sure you've got a copy of the poem in front of you somewhere. This could be your actual own version from the anthology. It may be you have to print one off of the internet. If you're going to do that, and if you do a little search for, as it says on my box there, Shelley Ozymandias, that's where you'll find it, and there's loads of websites with copies of this. So if you need to, pause this video now, go away and have a little look at that. And if you don't need to pause, we'll move on. And actually, we are going to pause the video one more time because it's really important that you just re-familiarise yourself with this poem by rereading it so it's in your head. So pause this video now for me, please, and just take a couple of minutes just to read through Ozymandias to yourself before I get started. I'm presuming you've done that. So let's talk about the poet. Be ready to write down some notes here. So we're talking about Percy Shelley, 1792 to 1822, died when he was only 30. One of the Romantic poets. Now this will link to Wordsworth and his poem from the anthology, Extract from the Prelude. They were in a similar group of poets who had similar ideas and beliefs, which we'll see on my next slide. He worked with lots of famous poets, as I've said there, and I've named a couple. Also, a little fact, married to Mary Shelley. She was the lady who went and wrote Frankenstein as well. So this was a very famous family with clever writers. But he was a bit of a radical. That's the other thing which is really important to note here about Percy Shelley. His thinking and his views were such that he didn't necessarily just follow what other people said. He liked to challenge what were like long-held ideas, what people believed was right. He wasn't afraid to. And actually that links to the context, which is my next slide. So as it says there, Shelley was a Romantic poet, meant he was interested in the natural world, and that's something to definitely write down, but also he was particularly interested in the power of nature, and again that's definitely something you want to be writing down, the fact he had this curiosity to do with this. He actually also disliked this absolute power. By absolute power, what we mean is the person who's in charge is completely 100% in charge and no one has any say-so on what goes on. A bit like a king or a queen in that sort of sense. So not like ours now, but back in history, certainly. But also it says that he was influenced by the French Revolution of 1792, which is where the monarchy was overthrown. The people got rid of their king or queen and actually chopped their heads off. But that may sound familiar to you if you've done any work on London, another poem from the anthology. That links in with the ideas of like not just believing about those in charge and challenging those ideas of the people in charge. So again, that sort of links to the ideas in London. But at the bottom bullet point there as well, Shelley was inspired after the discovery of the remains of a statue. That picture you see on the screen there, that is in the British Museum, and that is the artifact which inspired him to write the poem, which is a poem about a statue crumbling and falling apart. So it doesn't mean that the poem is about that statue, but that statue there is the one which made him think and create the ideas in his head that made him write that poem. So let's just talk very briefly about the title. This isn't one where I think there's too much going on there. The title is the nickname of the pharaoh. Ramesses II was the one in that statue that you just saw, and one of his names given to him was Ozymandias. And it's sort of very straightforward in that sort of sense, yet you could also maybe talk about that being quite egocentric. His name is the title of the poem, and no, he didn't choose it, but Shelley maybe is trying to reflect that idea of sort of self-importance and self-belief by naming the poem after this ruler who believed in his own power so much. So before we actually go through and break it down, just always worth looking at the form of the poem, or what you can call the structure of the poem as well. So it's written in a sonnet form. Sonnets are it's a very traditional way of writing poetry, and it's also got some very strict rules that you have to follow to make it a sonnet. Shelley decides to break those rules. For example, the rhyme scheme should be A, B, A, B, with every other line rhyming with the sort of 1 and 3 rhyming and 2 and 4, but we don't get that. We get the rhymes of land, sand and command, which command shouldn't be rhyming with the other two because it's only meant to be pairs. Then we've got stone, frown, red, and then it gets fed. So some rhyme, but not all rhyme. Therefore, it's broken, and you can talk about how the rhyme scheme, which is broken, mirrors the idea of the statue being broken and falling apart. And the same is true of what I've written there as iambic pentameter. Iambic pentameter is another thing you'd find in sonnets where there would be 10 beats in every line. Now, a number of these lines carry 10 beats, yet not all of them. And in some ways, again, it's like the iambic pentameter, the rhyme scheme and the rhythm is also broken as well. So you've got this sort of mirroring of the statue in there. There's also something just to point out as well, which is a volta on line 9, which is like a bit of a sort of a twist and sort of a change where it starts focusing on sort of different things. It moves on to talk about a separate idea, in this case the pedestal. But there you go, just talking a little bit about the form of the poem for you. And now we're just going to go through it. I've chunked it into sort of groups of lines, and I'll try and unpick a few bits. I won't have time to talk about everything in this video, but I'm going to try and draw your attention to key things that you definitely want to have annotated and written about. And it almost starts with like telling you the story. I met a traveller from an antique land, like this sort of, even the idea of antique is creating ideas of time, which is sort of a bit of a theme of this poem. And this traveller said, 2 vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Vast means enormous, trunkless means that these legs are missing the body that should sit on top of them. So try and picture a massive statue which has only got 2 legs left and the rest of it's fallen down. They stand in the desert, near them on the sand, half sunk, so it's almost like the sand is trying to like reclaim and take back the rock that the statue is made from. So it's half sunk, a shattered visage lies. The visage is like the outline of your face, like what you call the profile of your face. So it's shattered though, so it's broken to pieces. So even the face has sort of been destroyed as either time has destroyed it or somebody's destroyed it. And then it talks more about the face because it said, whose frown, so think about that expression, and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read. Basically saying, tell that the person who made the statue, the sculptor, really knew the person they were making the statue of, because they've captured the sneer of cold command. The sneer is where you sort of turn your lip up when you're sort of grinning at someone in a really evil way. And look at the alliteration, the hard alliteration of cold command there as well. So it's very brutal in the sounds, and it's a bit like the brutal ruler that they're trying to capture in the statue, which yet survive. And then it talks about stamped on these lifeless things. Think about that, the idea of stamped. So it's like to make a print on something is to stamp on it, like you'd make a stamp on paper, but it's almost talking about the stamp they've made in the rock. But it almost has this double meaning, because to stamp on something is to treat it really cruelly, a bit like the Ozymandias would have treated his people cruelly. The hand that mocked and the heart that fed. And on the pedestal, now the pedestal you can see in the picture there, that is the base of the statue, and there's writing on that pedestal which we're about to hear. My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Now that's really, really arrogant, the idea of I am the King of Kings, making himself sound like greater than anyone else. And he says, look on my works, like look on everything I created, you mighty people, and despair. Give up hope, because you will never be as great as I am. Yet, that is an ironic statement, because now if you stand there looking at his works, all you see is decay and wreck and things falling apart. So in some ways it's, like I say, ironic. And the idea of King of Kings almost gives this Jesus-like reference, because to be the King of Kings, that's what Jesus was almost given the name of. That's not a nickname, is not what you'd call it, but it's that sort of idea. But the irony that it's all fallen apart, like the picture shows you in the background. And then final lines, nothing beside remains. So nothing around this statue remains. Again, it's all crumbled and gone. Round the decay, good word for it, of that colossal wreck. So the statue is now, it was an enormous statue, it was colossal, but it's a wreck. So you almost got this sort of juxtaposition of words going on there, this amazingly big wreck. Boundless and bare. Again, listen to those hard sounds in that alliteration. Boundless and bare. Boundless means without limit, like there's no end to it. And bare just means like to be uncovered. So again, it just sounds like it's been fallen apart and almost just the loss of dignity. And then you've got more alliteration. The lone and level sands stretch far away, almost trying to make the reference to the fact that the stone statue has been returned or is returning to like dust, and sand is like grains of rock which has been eroded over time. So it's almost like time is reclaiming the statue, and time is more powerful than that ruler ever was. So there's some food for thought. Comparisons with other poems, which ones could it compare really well with? Well, if you're talking about power and sort of pride in your own abilities, then My Last Duchess would be a really good one to choose. However, if you want to talk about power of nature, then there's a whole load of them, including Extract from the Prelude perhaps. Exposure would be another one with the power of the weather, and also don't forget Storm on the Island in similar ways. So although Ozymandias isn't about the weather, it certainly is about like the power of nature and how nature and time are sort of taking back control. Hubris is a word I wanted to throw your way. Hubris is a great word, and it means like excessive self-pride. Too much belief in your own abilities is the way I'd put that into other words, and you can absolutely see that in Ozymandias. He believed he was going to be the greatest. However, as was shown, nothing lasts forever, including power. And just consider this idea as well. Consider what having a statue created of yourself suggests about you. If you want somebody to make a statue of you, sometimes people will decide to make statues of people, but if that person actually asks and tells people to make a statue of them, that tells you a lot about their arrogance, I would say. You're going to want to pause this slide. These are really good questions to help you with some annotation. Keywords in number 2, I've put in bold irony, which we talked about a little bit earlier, but think about the irony. Number 3 talks about a tyrant. A tyrant is somebody who rules through fear, and people obey them because they're afraid of them. And that's absolutely what you see in this poem, The Tyrant of Ozymandias. So work your way through those questions, use them to help you annotate your poem further. With your annotations, it's so important that you don't just write down things like alliteration, juxtaposition. You need to also write down the effect. Alliteration, which mirrors this, or juxtaposition, which shows this. So make sure you've got the detail in your annotations. A question I'd like you to have a go at. Remember, when it comes to your actual exam, you'll be asked to make a comparison of 2. For this exam, or this video, excuse me, I'm asking you just to focus a little bit more on one poem for now. So I've asked you in bold, how does Shelley explore ideas about power? So I've got an example coming up on my next slide. When you do yours, I think, which is at the bottom of my green box there, I've said, talk about the alliteration, which has the hard sounds, how they mirror the hard message to the reader, but also how they mirror the hard ruler that Ozymandias once was. And let me draw your attention to this. It's an example paragraph and how I would go about unpicking a poem. So use the underlined bits when you do your answer, copy those word for word, but then you then add the bits afterwards, and by doing that you're going to have a much stronger answer. My first bit in blue, my first blue sentence, is basically directly answering the question using the poem, as you'll see. My second blue sentence, I name a method. It's so important that you always name a method in your answer. You will gain more marks. The green bit is my evidence. I've tried to embed those quotes by dropping them into the sentences. Then in red, the red and the purple is bigger. That's because I'm showing harder skills and I want to show more of them. So the red bit is me analysing key bits of the quote that I used, and I'm actually unpicking the words and unpicking the methods and saying the effect of them. So that's really key. And then finally, the purple bit, I'm trying to work out why the poet wrote this poem and what they're trying to teach us. And by doing that, I'm showing the examiner that I've really thought closely about this. So use that one as help and use it as an example. And that comes to the end of my video on Ozymandias. Once again, a really good one to revise. It's got some very memorable quotes and it compares really well to lots of poems. So definitely one of those you want to keep revising in the run-up to your Year 11 exams. And to whatever stage you're at, whether you're a Year 9, 10 or 11, I wish you the very best of luck when it comes to any assessments that you may do. Work hard, and ultimately exams are about showing the examiner what's in your head. So don't be afraid to try and put down any ideas you've got. So this is Mr. Johnson saying thanks for listening and goodbye.